The quiet moment that makes you pause. There are certain moments in life that don't announce themselves. No dramatic music, no flashing lights, just a quiet pause in the middle of an ordinary day where something inside you shifts ever so slightly. Maybe you were scrolling through videos without thinking much about it. Maybe you were taking a break after a long day. Or maybe you were simply looking for something that could help you make sense of a feeling you've been carrying for a while. And then something caught your attention, not because it promised answers, not because it claimed to know your story, but because it felt strangely familiar, almost like someone was describing a mindset you've been quietly developing without even realizing it. There's a certain stage of personal growth where things start to feel different, not necessarily better in every way, not easier either, just different. The way you look at people begins to change. The way you respond to situations slowly shifts. Even the things that used to excite you or upset you don't land the same way anymore. And sometimes that can feel confusing, because when you're going through a real internal shift, it rarely happens all at once. It unfolds gradually, in small realizations that appear when you least expect them. You might notice that you no longer feel the need to prove yourself in the same ways you used to. You might realize that certain environments drain you faster than before. Or you might simply feel like you're standing between two versions of your life, the person you used to be and the person you're slowly becoming. That in-between space can feel strange. It's not always comfortable, but it's often where the most meaningful changes begin. And if something about this moment resonates with you today, it may simply mean you're paying attention to your inner life in a way that many people don't. Not because you're different from others, but because awareness has a way of waking people up gradually. And once that awareness begins to grow, it changes how you move through the world. The interesting part is that these shifts often happen quietly. No one sends you a message telling you it's happening. There's no clear sign saying you've entered a new chapter. Instead, it feels more like a series of small internal adjustments. A thought that lingers longer than usual. A realization that makes you look at the past differently. Or a moment of clarity that helps you understand why certain experiences shaped you the way they did. Those moments might seem small, but over time they begin to add up. And before you know it, you're not reacting to life the same way you once did. You're observing it more, reflecting on it more, and in some cases, you're even learning to step back from situations that once consumed your energy. That's not something most people talk about, but it's a very real part of personal evolution, because growth rarely looks like a sudden breakthrough. More often, it looks like a quiet shift in awareness that slowly reshapes how you see everything around you. And if that's where you find yourself today, somewhere in the middle of that process, then what you're experiencing might be more meaningful than you realize. When life starts feeling different, one of the earliest signs that something inside you is changing is subtle. It doesn't always look dramatic from the outside, but internally, you start noticing that certain patterns no longer make sense to you. Conversations that once felt normal now feel strangely repetitive. Situations that used to pull you into emotional reactions no longer affect you the same way. You might still care about people. You might still value connection. But there's a growing awareness inside you that makes it harder to ignore certain truths. Maybe you've started recognizing how much energy you used to spend trying to meet expectations that never really belonged to you. Or maybe you've realized that some of the pressure you carried for years was never actually yours to hold. Those realizations can be powerful, but they can also be uncomfortable. Because once you see something clearly, it becomes difficult to go back to pretending you don't notice it. That's one of the reasons personal growth can feel isolating at times. Not because you're separating yourself from others intentionally, but because your perspective is evolving. And when perspective changes, your relationship with certain habits, conversations, and environments naturally begins to shift. You might start asking deeper questions. Why did certain situations affect me so strongly before? Why did I spend so much time trying to control outcomes that were never fully in my hands? Why did I ignore my own intuition in moments when it was quietly trying to guide me in another direction? Those questions don't always have immediate answers, but asking them is often the beginning of a deeper understanding. And that understanding slowly reshapes how you move through life. Instead of reacting immediately, you start observing. Instead of forcing things to happen, you begin noticing what unfolds naturally. Instead of chasing validation, you start paying more attention to internal alignment. That shift may seem subtle, but it changes everything. Because when your attention moves inward, you begin discovering parts of yourself that were previously buried beneath noise, pressure, and constant distraction. You start recognizing your own patterns, your strengths, your blind spots, your emotional triggers. And with that awareness comes a new kind of responsibility. Not the heavy kind that weighs you down, but the quiet understanding that your growth is something only you can truly navigate. No one else can do it for you. People can offer advice. They can share their experiences. But the internal work, the reflection, the adjustments, the emotional maturity always happens on a personal level. That's why the process can't be rushed. Real transformation takes time. It takes patience. And sometimes it takes a willingness to sit with uncertainty while you figure out what the next step should look like. But the interesting thing is that once this process begins, most people don't want to go back to the old way of living, even if the journey feels challenging. Because awareness, once developed, tends to keep expanding. The season of stepping back. At some point during this internal shift, many people experience a phase that can feel confusing at first. It's the season where you naturally begin stepping back from certain things. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. You may notice yourself spending less time engaging in unnecessary arguments. You might feel less interested in explaining yourself to people who already made up their minds. And in some cases, you may even realize that silence is more powerful than constant reaction. That doesn't mean you've stopped caring. In many ways, it means the opposite. You've simply started recognizing that not every situation requires your energy. For years, many people operate under the assumption that they must respond to everything. Every opinion, every criticism, every misunderstanding. But growth introduces a different perspective. It teaches you that your energy is limited, and where you place that energy determines how your life unfolds. So instead of reacting to every moment, you start choosing your responses more carefully. You pause more often. You listen more closely. And sometimes, you decide that the most productive response is no response at all. This stage can feel strange, especially if you were once someone who always felt the need to engage. But stepping back isn't weakness. In many cases, it's maturity, because it shows that you've begun recognizing the difference between meaningful engagement and unnecessary noise. And once that awareness develops, it becomes easier to protect your mental and emotional space. You start valuing peace in a way you never did before. Not the superficial kind of peace that comes from avoiding reality, but the deeper kind that comes from understanding yourself and your boundaries. That kind of peace changes the way you move through the world. It allows you to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. It gives you the ability to observe situations with clarity, rather than getting pulled into every emotional wave around you. And over time, it strengthens something that many people spend years trying to develop: inner stability, the kind that doesn't depend on constant external approval, the kind that remains steady even when circumstances shift. That's when you start realizing something important. Growth isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like quiet restraint. Sometimes it looks like patience. And sometimes it looks like choosing a different path, even when the old path still feels familiar. Why awareness changes your relationships. As your awareness deepens, something interesting begins to happen in your relationships. It's not always dramatic. There's rarely a single moment where everything suddenly changes. Instead, it feels like a gradual shift in how you experience the people around you. You begin noticing dynamics that once felt normal but now seem unbalanced. You start recognizing patterns in conversations that used to pass by unnoticed. Sometimes it's the way certain people only reach out when they need something. Sometimes it's the way a discussion turns tense the moment you express an honest opinion. And sometimes it's simply the quiet realization that you've outgrown a version of yourself that once fit perfectly within certain circles. That realization can feel complicated because growth doesn't erase your appreciation for the past. You can still care about people you've known for years. You can still value the memories you've shared. But awareness has a way of revealing things that are hard to ignore once you see them clearly. You might start recognizing that some relationships were built around habits rather than genuine connection. Maybe you bonded over shared frustration, gossip, or constant distraction. When those habits begin to fade, the relationship itself can feel different. Conversations become shorter. Silences last a little longer. And sometimes, both people quietly sense that something has shifted. This doesn't mean anyone is the villain in the story. Most of the time, it simply means people are evolving in different directions. Growth rarely happens at the same pace for everyone. Some people become curious about deeper conversations and self-reflection. Others remain comfortable with the familiar patterns they've always known. Neither path is inherently wrong, but when those paths begin to diverge, the distance can become noticeable. You might find yourself less interested in certain topics that once filled hours of conversation. You might feel more drawn to discussions about ideas, purpose, or personal development. And when those interests change, the energy within your relationships naturally changes as well. This is often where people experience a quiet tension. Part of you may want to maintain every connection exactly as it was before. But another part of you understands that growth sometimes reshapes the structure of relationships, not necessarily by ending them abruptly, but by redefining how they exist in your life. Some friendships remain strong, but evolve into something calmer and more respectful. Others slowly fade because the foundation they were built on no longer exists. That process can feel emotional. After all, humans are wired for connection. Letting relationships shift or loosen can feel like losing a familiar piece of your life. But growth doesn't always mean cutting people off. Sometimes it simply means adjusting your expectations. It means recognizing where a relationship naturally belongs in your life now. Some people remain close. Some become occasional voices in your world. And others become memories that helped shape who you are today. Understanding this helps remove a lot of unnecessary guilt. Because personal evolution isn't about abandoning people. It's about allowing life to move forward without forcing everything to stay exactly the same. And when you accept that reality, relationships begin to feel less like obligations and more like genuine choices. You engage with people because the connection feels meaningful, not because you feel pressured to maintain it. That shift brings a new kind of authenticity into your life, one where your interactions are based on honesty rather than habit. And while that transition can feel uncomfortable at first, it often leads to connections that feel more aligned with the person you are becoming. The unexpected loneliness of personal growth. One of the least discussed parts of personal growth is the quiet loneliness that sometimes accompanies it. This loneliness isn't always about being physically alone. You can be surrounded by people and still feel it. It's more about the internal distance that develops when your perspective begins to change. When you start reflecting deeply on your life, your habits, and your mindset, your internal world becomes more active. You spend more time thinking about meaning, direction, and personal responsibility. And while those reflections can be empowering, they can also create moments where you feel slightly out of sync with the environment around you. You might notice that some conversations feel surface level compared to the thoughts you've been exploring internally. Topics that once entertained you for hours now feel repetitive. Certain social environments that once energized you begin to feel exhausting. This doesn't mean you've become judgmental or distant. It simply means your focus has shifted. When people go through a period of genuine self-reflection, their attention often turns inward. They start analyzing their own behavior, questioning their motivations, and exploring what kind of life they truly want to build. That internal process can create temporary space between you and the familiar routines you once relied on. And in that space, loneliness can appear. But it's important to understand that this type of loneliness is not always a negative signal. Sometimes it's simply a transitional phase, a period where your identity is reorganizing itself. Think about how much of your life may have been shaped by expectations, habits, and external influence. From childhood through adulthood, people are constantly absorbing ideas about success, identity, and belonging. When you begin questioning those ideas, you're essentially rebuilding your internal framework. That process takes time, and during that time, it's natural to feel slightly disconnected from the old structures that once defined your sense of normal. But something interesting happens when you move through this phase patiently. You begin discovering a deeper relationship with yourself. You learn how to sit with your own thoughts without needing constant distraction. You become more comfortable with reflection. You start understanding your own emotions more clearly. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin recognizing why certain feelings arise. That level of self-awareness strengthens your internal stability. And as that stability grows, the loneliness that once felt heavy begins to transform. It becomes solitude, a space where you can think clearly, recharge emotionally, and reconnect with your own direction. Solitude isn't about isolation. It's about having enough internal clarity that you don't rely on constant noise to feel complete. And when you reach that point, your interactions with others become more intentional. You're not seeking connection to escape yourself. You're choosing connection because it genuinely adds value to your life. That difference changes the quality of your relationships and the way you show up in the world. Recognizing the difference between reaction and intention. Another shift that often occurs during periods of personal growth is the realization that many of our actions used to be automatic reactions. For years, most people move through life responding to situations without pausing to examine their responses. Someone criticizes you, and you immediately defend yourself. Someone misunderstands you, and you rush to explain your side. A stressful event occurs, and your mind instantly jumps to frustration or anxiety. These reactions feel natural because they've been practiced for so long. But once you begin developing deeper awareness, You start noticing the space between an event and your response. That space may only last a few seconds at first, but it changes everything. Because within that brief pause, you gain the ability to choose how you respond. Instead of reacting automatically, you can step back and observe the situation more clearly. You can ask yourself simple but powerful questions. Is this situation worth my energy? Will reacting immediately improve the outcome? Or would patience create a better response? Learning to pause doesn't mean you suppress your emotions. Emotions are natural signals that help you understand your experiences. But reacting impulsively to every emotion often leads to unnecessary conflict and stress. Intentional response, on the other hand, allows you to acknowledge your feelings without letting them control your actions. This shift is a sign of emotional maturity. It shows that you're becoming more aware of your internal patterns. And once you develop this awareness, you begin recognizing how often people around you are still operating on automatic reactions. Arguments escalate because neither person pauses to reflect. Misunderstandings grow because both sides react defensively instead of seeking clarity. Stress multiplies because individuals respond to pressure with immediate frustration rather than thoughtful adjustment. Seeing these patterns can be eye-opening. It may even change how you approach everyday interactions. Instead of getting pulled into every emotional wave around you, you begin responding with more intention. Sometimes that means asking questions instead of making assumptions. Sometimes it means allowing a moment of silence rather than filling the space with quick words. And sometimes it means choosing to disengage from situations that no longer deserve your attention. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you deliberate. You're no longer driven solely by immediate emotion. You're guided by awareness. And that awareness creates a different kind of strength. One that isn't loud or aggressive, but steady, thoughtful, and grounded. Over time, people around you may even notice this change. They may not always understand it, but they'll sense that you're approaching life with a level of calm that wasn't there before. That calm doesn't come from having perfect control over life. It comes from understanding yourself more clearly. And when that understanding grows, your responses naturally become more intentional. The moment you realize you're not the same person anymore, there often comes a moment during personal growth where you look back at your past self and feel a strange mix of familiarity and distance. You recognize the person you used to be. You remember the decisions you made, the habits you had, and the mindset that guided your actions. But at the same time, something about that version of you feels different from who you are now. It's not about judging your past. Most people were simply doing the best they could with the awareness they had at the time. But growth changes the lens through which you see those experiences. You begin recognizing why certain situations affected you so strongly. You start understanding the insecurities or pressures that once shaped your decisions. And instead of feeling stuck in those patterns, you begin seeing them as part of a longer journey of development. This realization can feel powerful because it shows that change is not only possible, it's already happening. The habits you once struggled with may not have the same control over you anymore. The situations that once triggered intense reactions may now feel manageable. And the identity you once believed defined you may no longer feel like the full story. Identity is not as fixed as many people believe. It evolves as you learn, experience, and reflect. Every challenge you navigate, every lesson you absorb, and every moment of honest self-evaluation contributes to that evolution. But recognizing that change can feel strange at first. Because when you grow internally, the external world doesn't always update immediately. People who knew you years ago may still expect the same behavior they're used to. Old environments may still carry memories of who you once were. And occasionally, you might even feel tempted to slip back into familiar patterns simply because they're comfortable. But once awareness has taken root, it becomes difficult to fully return to the old version of yourself. You've seen too much. You've understood too much. And even when growth feels challenging, something inside you knows that moving forward is the only direction that truly makes sense. That awareness becomes a quiet form of guidance, not a loud voice demanding change, just a steady reminder that the person you are becoming deserves the same attention and care as the person you once were, the quiet strength of emotional maturity. At some point in the process of personal growth, people begin discovering a form of strength that doesn't always look impressive from the outside. It's not loud, it doesn't demand attention, and it rarely shows up in dramatic moments. Instead, it appears in the way you handle everyday situations. Emotional maturity often reveals itself through small decisions. Choosing patience when frustration would be easier. Listening fully before responding. Accepting that not every misunderstanding needs to turn into a debate. These actions may seem simple, but they represent something deeper. They show that you've started prioritizing clarity over ego. For many people, the earlier stages of life are shaped by constant comparison and external validation. There's pressure to prove yourself, pressure to win arguments, pressure to demonstrate that you're right. But as awareness grows, those pressures begin to lose their influence. You start realizing that being understood is more valuable than being right. You begin recognizing that protecting your peace often matters more than winning a momentary disagreement. That shift doesn't happen overnight. It develops through reflection and experience. Sometimes it comes after realizing how exhausting constant conflict can be. Sometimes it comes after noticing how much emotional energy is wasted on situations that don't actually change your life. But once emotional maturity begins to take root, your priorities naturally evolve. You start investing more energy into things that genuinely contribute to your well-being. Meaningful work, healthy relationships, creative ideas, personal growth. The need to control every outcome begins to fade. And in its place, something more stable begins to grow. Perspective. Perspective allows you to step back from situations that once felt overwhelming. It helps you see challenges as temporary rather than permanent. It reminds you that life is rarely defined by a single moment or mistake. And most importantly, perspective allows you to approach life with a sense of calm confidence. Not because you believe everything will always go perfectly. Not because you believe everything will always go perfectly. But because you trust your ability to navigate whatever comes next. That quiet confidence becomes one of the most valuable things you can develop. It doesn't require constant reassurance from others. It doesn't depend on approval or applause. It grows internally through the experiences you've faced and the lessons you've chosen to learn from them. And when that kind of confidence becomes part of who you are, it changes the way you move through the world. You become less reactive, more thoughtful, more grounded. And people often sense that difference, even if they can't fully explain it. If any part of this reflection connected with something you've been thinking about lately, feel free to share your perspective in the comments. What is one realization or shift in mindset that has changed the way you see your life recently? Your insight might resonate with someone else who's quietly going through a similar phase of growth. And conversations like that often create some of the most meaningful moments in this community.